A grisaille is how you'll take your value sketch and move it to a real canvas. But first, let's talk about what a grisaille is and where it came from historically. A grisaille is simply a monochromatic painting on a canvas, and that's usually done in shades of grays, but it's also sometimes done in very neutral colors. Grisailles can be paintings in their own right, and this example from Bruegel is a classic. Sometimes those grisailles are trompe-l'oeil, so they are there to mimic statuary, and a great example of that is in the Renaissance altarpieces of Europe, where the outside panel has paintings which look like statues, and that's the way the altarpiece looks on a normal day. And then on high holidays or when somebody really important comes to town, they open them up and there's the full panoply of heaven in color, which is kind of a cool effect. Grisailles are used in stained glass, and the example I have here is the fabulous Five Sisters window from York Minster. And grisailles were often used in illuminated manuscripts. But the application of grisailles, which interests us most today, is as an underpainting. An underpainting is not imprimatura, which simply is toning your canvas. So that sets the tonal range for the canvas, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later in this section. But an underpainting is the first sweep of the oil painting. And while the paint application system for alla prima in indirect paint is very different, the way we apply the grisaille is, curiously enough, almost the same. Let me explain the difference between direct painting and indirect painting. Indirect painting is sometimes called old master's painting. And what it is a series of very, very thin glazes, which build up the image over time. So each of these glazes is laid down and allowed to dry. And the goal is to not cover every single section of paint with opaque paint, because you want the light to come through the paint layers, bounce off the canvas, and come back. It gives tremendous luminosity. That's its great advantage. The great disadvantage of indirect painting is that it's very slow, it's very measured, and it's very controlled. So it's appropriate for some things and not for others. In indirect painting, the grisaille sets the value layers for all the subsequent layers, and it's often allowed to show through. Rembrandt is a great master of indirect painting. And if you look at his portraits, you'll see many passages where the underlayers are allowed to show through. And Rembrandt finished those by using an opaque layer almost at the very end to set the light tones for the skin. He often would glaze right over the top of those light tones, which is why he gets a masterful feeling of real skin. The Concord of the States, which is the example I'm showing here, shows clearly his ability to allow the grisaille to be seen through all of the layers. It takes a long time to do a masterful indirect painting. The Concord of the States took Rembrandt 6 years to finish, and that might be part of the reason it's not so popular anymore. The alternative is what we call direct painting, alla prima, or wet on wet. And while we associate it with the Impressionists and beyond, it's not new. There are painters from the Renaissance who did it very masterfully. In direct painting, or alla prima painting, the paint is applied wet over wet. And that doesn't mean that you're always painting over a wet layer, because sometimes you just can't do that. There's not enough time. But it does mean that you're using opaque layers and you're not allowing the substrate to come through. Direct painting has been popular since the mid-19th century because it allows for loose lyrical brushwork and a quick capture of the changing scene. While the Impressionists did not invent direct painting, they certainly brought it to its zenith. And this example I have here is a John Singer Sargent of the painter Claude Monet painting by the side of the woods. Today, you find very few painters using an indirect method. So why would you want to move a grisaille under your painting if you're just going to paint over it anyways? One thing is, as in indirect painting, you might choose to leave some of those bottom layers showing. But more importantly, the grisaille is a way of setting a value structure on your canvas and making sure it works. But Carol, you say, we did that in step number 2, the value drawing, and that's absolutely true. But you need to know how to take that drawing that you did so well and transfer it to your canvas accurately. And again, check your values and check your composition to make sure that they work. That is the most important part of painting. Carol, you may also ask, how can I paint over that dark wet without making mud? And we will talk about that in great detail further on in this lesson. Sometimes painting the grisaille allows you to work out difficult drafting issues. Again, you could say, Carol, I worked on that in the value drawing, and that's true. But brushes work differently than pencils do, and sometimes you need to practice before you hit your final strokes. Anything that you can do in the preparatory stages of painting will make your final painting looser and more lyrical. Proper underpainting facilitates good overpainting. So what do I mean by that? That just means that if you set all of the layers down properly, you should be able to follow them easily as you develop further into the painting. Conversely, a bad underpainting is going to mean a bad painting. And if you should find that you're not following your grisaille as you develop the painting, you need to carefully analyze why. Because that either means your design was flawed at the beginning or you are straying from the straight and narrow. Sometimes when you transfer your grisaille to the canvas, you realize that you've left large sections of it unresolved. It's really common to do this in the foreground. You've spent so much time doing the midfield, which is where all the action is, and you've got this large lawn coming forward, and you don't know what to do with the foreground, so you just sort of leave it because the human eye interpolates there. That's great for the viewer to be able to interpolate, but it's not so great for the painter because sooner or later you're going to have to put some paint there. If you get to that point with grisaille, it's a sign that you need to step back and figure out what was supposed to go there in the first place. Why do a value drawing at all if you're just going to redo it on your canvas? The biggest reason is you're going to cover all or most of this grisaille up with paint. And as things change, you won't have your value drawing. Oh, I'll remember it, you say. Actually, you won't remember it. It's just going to go off in Never Never Land in your brain. And that's extremely important when you're working in a situation with quickly changing light. You have to be able to choose a view in your value drawing and stay with it. The grisaille is under there, but your value drawing stays as your map. The other reason to do it that way is that it's much easier to make design decisions with a pencil than it is with a brush. We're going to start with the imprimatura, or as we call it, toning the canvas. And we're going to discuss what colors are suitable, why you might choose certain colors, what paints are suitable for what surfaces, and I will also talk to you a little bit about painting on birch boards and allowing the grain to become your imprimatura. Then we're going to talk about transferring your picture to your canvas, including the crop. Along with that, we're going to talk about the naughty business of aspect ratio. And I'm sorry, painters, here we're going to do a little arithmetic, but I promise you it's not going to be any more difficult than something you learned in the 3rd grade, and it will help you immensely. I'll give you an example of gridding, which can be as simple as putting a cross mark in the center of your sketchbook, or as complicated as putting 2-inch squares across a canvas. Then we get to the fun part where we start actually painting, and I'll talk to you about colors that are suitable for a grisaille and how you put that paint on so that it's just the proper moisture, that it can move around, but it doesn't creep up into your paints. So how you avoid muddy paint in the upper layers. And last, I'll talk to you a little bit about another way that some of my peers underpaint, which is color blocking. And I'll talk to you about why I don't do that, but why they do that. So stick with me, folks. This is going to be fun.